Pratham? Pratham, you have to unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. So sorry for the noise, background noise. I think there's some construction work going on, but I think I'm audible, right? Yeah, cool. Hi, hello everyone. On behalf of the Dark, I Pratham take immense pride to welcome you all to what is the 25th Dark Baithak session. Just a bit about the Dark. The Dark began in 2023 as a book review journal, publishing original reviews across disciplines and genres. From the right go, we have been trying to reimagine the form of book review itself, encouraging writing that moves beyond summary to engage critically, reflectively, and creatively with the world that a book opens up for us. Over time, however, we have grown into a biannual academic journal that now includes reviewers, explainers, commentaries, and research essays. Each issue is built around a central theme, bringing together diverse voices that explore the intersections across social sciences. A double-blind peer review process ensures rigor, while an editorial approach values accessibility and creative thought. Beyond the journal, the Dark has grown into a vibrant collective. Through our reading groups, we meet every month as a shared book, discovering new perspectives through conversation. Through the Dark Weekly, we publish personal essays, topical reflections, and explainers that extend our conversation into the present moment. The Dark Baithak, however, is a small attempt to huddle around a small gathering of scholars, writers, students from different fields to present ideas and initiate dialogue, bringing critical conversations to life. Our session today, for which we are extremely excited, is called The Caste of Smell, Sensing and Resisting in Dalit Literature. Our speaker for today is Dr. Shivani Kapoor. Dr. Shivani Kapoor is a political scientist who works on questions of caste, sexes, and labor from an interdisciplinary perspective and is particularly interested in the olfactory experience of caste in the leather industry in India. She is also interested in questions of representation, voice, and the formation of self and community identities through writing and its circulation, especially in the form of Dalit autobiographical literature in Hindi. Prior to joining the Center for Study of Development Society, she has taught at OP Jindal Global University, Shivani University, and the University of Delhi. We are most excited to have you. A bit about a discussant who is Deepak. Deepak is a PhD candidate and is also a part of the TheDaak and works on the representation of Berlin in German cinema. Just a bit about how the session is going to pan out. The invited speaker normally speaks for about 20 to 30 minutes, but we'll be glad to have you speak for more than that, followed by a brief remark by the discussant and then an open floor question and answer with the participant. With that done, now may welcome Dr. Shivani Kapoor whenever you're comfortable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jigyasa, Pratham, and the larger sort of Dark Collective for this invitation. As academics, we are always looking for newer audiences to sort of interact with and share our work and get new ideas. And so this is a very exciting opportunity. And thank you also to Deepak for agreeing to discuss this. I look forward to hearing from you as well, Deepak. So, before I start, a small disclaimer. I'm at a place where there might be frequent power cuts. So, I think the internet will stay on, but you might see the background go dark or light. So, please ignore. In case I'm disconnected, I will get back in, but hopefully it should work. So, I thought today let's keep it short and conversational, and so I'm going to be targeting 20 to 25 minutes. And like Pratham already said, I'm going to be talking about reading, reading some smells and some other senses and some other sensory phenomena in Dalit literature, and thinking about the ways in which Dalit writers are not just representing their lives via the sensory, but also, and this is the new part of my work, and so which is why I want to open it out to all of you as well. But I also want to think about how is it that they are countering or resisting, if I may use that very loaded word, but how are they actually countering or turning the nose or turning the gaze back to rather Brahminical ways in which their lives have been written about? And we know that a lot of autobiographical or even literary writing, which we have now come to understand is also autobiographical, even if it doesn't carry the tag of an autobiography, especially when written from the margins. Or from places of power, or from places which speak back to power. And so a lot of this writing is also responding to the ways in which caste has framed their lives and discourses, social and political, around them. But ever so often, and now increasingly so, we are getting instances in Dalit's writing of turning the gaze back and sort of reworking and resymbolizing ways in which lives and social worlds and political worlds are written about. And so I thought, let me open up this idea and share it with all of you and see where this goes. And so, this is part of my, I mean, what I'm going to talk about today is part of my larger work, which looks at leather production, and the formal spaces of leather production. And I look at the question of smell and how caste is experienced and reproduced and negotiated through smells in leather production. But a large part of that, that work is done in the material realm of factories and tanneries and so on and so forth. But Dalit writing has been an important sort of interlocutor in that process, because it is such a rich archive of experiences and politics and politics against power, speaking against power, that it not just fills in the gaps of ethnography, but it also sort of comes in once the limits of ethnography are reached. And so, um, in a sense, I have spent a lot of time thinking about some of these narratives. But like I said, it's also something that it almost runs as a parallel stream with my work. So that's how these two are sort of located. These two parts of my work are located. Um, and in the larger work as well, I'm trying to think a little bit more about how to think about leather away from the dominant caste framing of leather as necessarily polluted, as necessarily complicated by caste. So, what are the other kinds of narratives that literature is giving us, where leather is thought of differently? And so, today I thought what I'll do is I will focus on. So I try to make it a bit broad based, in the sense that I'll try to get in a few more senses other than smell. Um, but because I primarily work with leather and smell and Hindi narratives, those are the dominant things that I can present to you. But I thought, let me look at two ideas and two texts for today's talk. And the two ideas that I'm looking at is, one is this idea of humiliation and violence that a lot of Dalit lives are forced to undergo, and which makes its way into the writing that they do. Now, I look at the question of humiliation and violence through leather, but there are many other kinds of objects and spaces that perpetuate this humiliation and this violence in Dalit lives. The other idea that I want to bring in is the question of pride, and especially pride in certain occupations like leather work, which are also very lucrative, financially, economically speaking, as well as in terms of recognition. These are very lucrative operations. So I want to think a little bit about pride, but also about turning the gaze back through writing. And maybe I'll end with um, a little bit of an invocation to the readers, which is us, and how is it that a multisensory way of reading, what does it do to the act of writing, but also what does it do to this collective discourse that we are part of when we are reading, writing, circulating texts, talking about them, and so on and so forth. And the two so I'll take some other examples, but the two major texts that I'll be looking at are basically two short stories. One is, okay, it's two short stories. I'll introduce them as we sort of go along. So, I don't have a PPT. I will be doing the old-fashioned thing of reading out parts of what I have to say, but also then I'll be talking to you in the middle. Okay, so here it goes. Um, Let me open by thinking a little bit about the question of caste, writing, and the senses together, and what is the kind of material that we get when we put these three ideas together. So, in the opening paragraphs of Dr. Tulsi Ram's autobiography, Murdhaya, and a lot of this material is in Hindi, not just one standard Hindi, but many versions of Hindi. And some of it is translated by others, some of it is translated by me, but primarily I'm reading these texts in some version of Hindi. So, in the opening paragraphs of Dr. Tulsi Ram's autobiography Murdhaya, we encounter a sentence which starts as, and I quote, my grandfather, who was called Jhutan, unquote. I'm not going to the rest of the sentence. Jhutan, a Hindi word, refers to leftovers or half eaten food. It also refers to the practice followed across India of giving away leftover food to people from lower caste communities. This practice derives from the discriminating and humiliating principles of caste, which bind people in a graded hierarchy according to the caste groups into which they were born. Tulsi Ram's autobiography introduces us to his grandfather Jhutan, who belonged to the Chamar caste in eastern Uttar Pradesh, Azamgarh, roughly the area, and used to work as a bonded laborer in the field of Brahmin landlords, an occupation that was passed on to Tulsi Ram's father as well. Just as an aside, Tulsi Ram, of course, was a professor at the School of International Studies at JNU. So that's also a trajectory that's worth thinking about. Um, the name Jhutan, possibly a metonym given to, because we couldn't possibly think that somebody was named Jhutan. So, possibly a metonym given to the grandfather by the upper castes, signifies his lowly and degraded status, much like half eaten food. It also signifies the caste marked feudal relationship between those who throw away food and those who are forced to consume the half eaten, often rotting food. The name also draws our attention to the ways in which the organization of the senses and sensory experiences are crucial in the practice and structuring of the caste system. Leftover food or half eaten food invokes a strong sense of disgust. It assails the visual, the olfactory, the gustatory by signifying something that was discarded or could be rotten or purifying. Further, leftover food carries with it strong associations of being contaminated with another's saliva. And there's some very interesting work on different ways in which we think about this contamination with saliva and across race, caste, and other such systems. So Jhutan's name thus reiterates his permanently polluted state at every utterance and a permanently polluted sensory state also at every utterance. It is significant that another very famous Dalit author, Om Prakash Valmiki, also agrees to give his or to name his autobiography Jhutan at the suggestion of a fellow writer and editor. And there's a very interesting conversation there in the preface to his autobiography. So, the caste system, as we know, fundamentally relies on maintaining these distances between castes, between all kinds of castes, through maintaining norms of purity and pollution. And I have argued in my work elsewhere that this maintenance of purity pollution is an exercise in a very careful negotiation of sensory perception and experience. So, ultimately, we end up in a caste discourse where everything, names, how they are spelled, languages, dialects, taste of food, odor of food, touch, the metal of the jewelry you wear, the height of the boundary wall of your home, everything is indicative of caste status, right? And so, Gopal Guru, for instance, has argued that due to the many compulsions of modernity, untouchability, which was one of the most obvious forms of caste practice, may no longer appear on the surface of social interaction, and it has been forced to slide to the bottom of the hierarchical mind, but it has not disappeared. It still exists. And so, to understand how caste functions, Guru would argue one needs to do an archaeology of caste, archaeology of the experience of caste. Now, in my larger work, I take on from Guru's suggestion of archaeology and take it forward to argue that one of the ways in which to understand this sort of burying of caste and the burying of obverse, obvious discrimination of caste would be through interrogating its sensory arrangements, right? And the way in which bodies, spaces, and objects are sensorily arranged to suit certain kinds of caste discourses. Now, to give you an illustration of this, Suraj Pal Chauhan, and so Suraj Pal Chauhan is also a Dalit writer, author who's written his autobiography Tiraskrit. Unlike Tulsi Ram, who belongs to the leatherworking community, Chauhan comes from the Valmiki community, so basically forced to do manual scavenging and sanitation work. So Chauhan writes about the dexterity. And so here we also start seeing that complexity of that question of humiliation, your occupation as humiliating, but also as something you take pride in. So he writes about the dexterity that his caste community has in dealing with pigs. Right? So a lot of Valmiki communities and adjacent communities in UP, for instance, also deal with pigs. So Khatiks are a close community to the Valmikis. Chauhan recalls one such instance when his uncle Gulfan, who possessed great skills in slaughtering pigs, was working on a recently caught pig to distribute the meat within the community. As Gulfan was dismembering the pig, he flung its urinary bladder at the group of children nearby, secretly signaling Chauhan to catch it. It was a from the narrative, it's clear that it was a prized object. Nobody would eat it, but it has many other uses. As Chauhan caught the coveted bladder, the urine within it fell all over his body. Later, his mother cleaned the bladder, and for the next few days, Chauhan played with it as a balloon. Later, he converted it into a small drum. Again, the practices of Dalit communities converting animal skin to drums is very well documented, but this is the first instance I read of another body part being used. So Chauhan writes, and I quote, "The bladder would stink when I would bring it close to my mouth to fill it with air, but I was not disgusted by that stench. However, the thing is that poverty forced us to have such a destiny." Right. And so here is Chauhan also not just talking about the dexterity that his uncle possessed in dealing with pigs, but is also talking about the fact that there are no options but to sort of deal with materials and objects that other upper caste communities would not do so. So Chauhan's narrative and the sensorium of the pig's bladder is deeply indicative of the ways in which caste practices force certain communities into the margins of society, dignity, and resources. This narrative also provides an insight into how caste structures and produces sensorial experience for the person experiencing them firsthand. And of course, it's retelling in rewriting that Chauhan does, but also for the reader, right? And one can pause a moment here and think about the kind of sensorial and phenomenological sort of experiences we undergo when we read something like this or when we hear this experience of Chauhan, especially when we are dealing with cases of disgust and humiliation. Now, of course, I don't need to sort of elaborate to this audience that Dalit literature per se has been a very powerful site of sort of protest and resistance against the caste order. It's also seen as a testimonial against the violence that caste perpetuates. And Debjani Ganguly, for instance, writing about these narratives, rightly argues that these narratives sort of inaugurate a Dalit personhood, which unsettles the celebratory mood of late modern Indian democracy, right? And it punctures that celebration to point attention to these very sort of pressing matters of which have still not sort of been resolved. And so, by exposing intimate details of caste experience, Dalit writers have thus sort of staked a claim to representation and their place in history. And these narratives are sort of important and are used by Dalit writers often at the risk of the possibility of being humiliated again through the dialogical act of reading and writing. And Gopal Guru again has written about how these narratives which may injure the self of the writer all over again, because it's very embarrassing and humiliating to admit to a lot of these experiences in writing in public. But Guru says, writers are taking that risk because they want to sort of invoke guilt in the minds of the upper castes, right? So it's a very powerful move that these writers are making. Now, taking this forward, in this piece, I've also tried to argue that Dalit writers are also then using this space to challenge Brahminical hegemony in defining their lives. So, narratives of glorious histories, defiant heroes, and the invigoration of pride in caste occupations and practices is thus also something that Dalit autobiographies or Dalit writing is doing, apart from, of course, telling us about the humiliating, violent, and embarrassing bits as well. Right, and this is where I sort of get interested in the sensory nature of the language of this kind of literature, because senses are not just our windows to the world. They're not just sort of portals through which we access the world via sight and smell and taste and so on and so forth, but they also produce and categorize the experience of this world for us, reiterate the discursive connections between the reader and the writer's world, right? And so, two very exciting authors, Vaskul and Vanini, who've written on the senses, have argued, and I quote, it is not only a knowing subject and the object of symbolic knowledge. So senses are not just a knowing subject and the object of symbolic knowledge, but more precisely, a feeling and sensing subject, the object of somatic experience. So, a sensory overlay, I would argue, on this reading and writing of any kind of texts seeks to understand the sensing subject of caste. And all of us, even the readers, would then become the sensing subject of caste. Right. So this is the setup. This is the sort of the theoretical conceptual field. But let me now actually give you two narratives. One a case of humiliation in a short story which has to do with stench and leather, and the other is one of reclamation and pride. So, and I'm going to end with those two narratives. So, the first one, the first short story that I want to discuss is a short story titled Badbu, which means foul smell, which is written by a very celebrated Punjabi writer, Mohanlal Filoria. Um, and I read this story in Hindi in this magazine called Dalit Asmita. There was no mention of a translator involved. So I'm not sure whether Filoria wrote it in Hindi or translated it himself. I'm not sure. But for me, the story appeared in Hindi. Now, it's a very, very interesting sort of narrative, and let me summarize it for you. So, the narrative is around two figures. One is a named character who is Garib Das, who has a small hide curing workshop on the outskirts of a large city, and his workshop has been charged with sort of spreading nuisance, so environmental nuisance, so foul odors, noise, sight, so on and so forth, and also environmental pollution. And so he's battling this case in court. So his shop has to be shut, and he has gone to court. And in this story, he's visiting his lawyer, and he's very agitated, and he says, he makes a very interesting claim. He says the judicial process, the judges, the jury, and even his own lawyer, Garib Das says, seems to think he's not worthy of justice because he supposedly smells bad. And here, of course, bad is the overlay of the smell of his work, which is hide curing, which is a smelly occupation, intrinsic sort of connection being made between the odor of his work and how possibly he himself, Garib Das himself, could be smelling, is the cunning of caste, really. So he says, I don't think the case is going anywhere because all of you seem to think that I smell bad and thus I do not deserve justice. And of course, the lawyer is trying to placate him, and Garib Das makes a very interesting revelation to the reader at this point, where he says that, he tells the lawyer, I'm very surprised that you have these prejudices against me, considering that your relatives are still engaged in tanning. Right, and this word still, कि वो अभी भी ये काम करते हैं, they still do this work, is something that I want to focus on a little bit. So Garib Das is as a very sort of marginalized figure in the judicial system. Garib Das is also turning the gaze back at a member of a fellow caste, but as a fellow member of the same caste, but also a different class configuration, a different occupational configuration, and saying, you should understand what I'm going through because your relatives still do this. And in that still is also this sort of a big tension, which is saying that you may be a lawyer, but you do still belong to this caste, and you must thus have empathy, have solidarity, and must understand where I am coming from. Right, and so it's a very peculiar position for the lawyer because there's no visible or smellable marker of caste on him, and the lawyer is unnamed in the story throughout, so we don't really know much more about him. But as Jadumani Mahanand has recently argued, caste is read on bodies through various sort of coded and whispered interactions, right? And caste is thus made legible to the larger public, up for humiliation, up for violence, because you don't necessarily always need to announce your caste. So while this conversation is happening, there's a knock on the door. The lawyer opens. This conversation is happening in the lawyer's house. The lawyer opens the door. There are state officials standing outside saying there is a complaint against you by some of your neighbors because you're running a professional office in a residential complex. And the lawyer is slightly perturbed because he can meet his clients in his residence as a lawyer. And upon further inquiry, the officials admit that they made inquiries, they found nothing wrong that the lawyer has done. And so, in confidence, they want to tell him that the neighbor seemed to be perturbed by something else, and the complaint is a cover-up for another kind of concern that the neighbor has, which is that the neighbor is a little angry that the lawyer has displayed the educational qualifications of himself and his family members on the nameplate outside their board, right? And the officials say that the neighbor has told them that how can a lower caste person have such claims to knowledge and power? Now, the lawyer is, of course, in a bit of a trouble here, and there's also a classic case of humiliation, as Gopal Guru again sort of defines humiliation. That humiliation always needs a third party, needs a witness, who sees you being humiliated. And here is the lawyer hearing all of this in front of his client, who has just told him your relatives still do tanning. And at this point, Filoria, the writer, turns her attention to Garib Das, whose petulant state is gone now, and he's smiling, and he's sort of a little feeling a little assured that there is a bigger mistrial happening here rather than in the courtroom, right? And the narrative ends with Garib Das telling the lawyer that in the village, in my workshop, I smell of hides. But here it seems your degrees smell rather foul to your neighbors, right? And it's a very, very powerful kind of an invocation where, in the absence of material basis for any sort of sensory experience, we are seeing cases where people are perceived to smell foul, and that has material consequences. So it's not as if the consequences are solely symbolic as well, which is not to say that the sensory world is only symbolic. It's deeply, deeply material. So that's one kind of literature that I am really seeing in what I'm surveying. But the other kind of literature, the other kind of instances that is coming up in literature is something that I want to present from this autobiography of Shivraj Singh Bechen. So Shivraj Singh teaches in Delhi University. He's a professor. Bechen is the sort of pen name that he adopts. His autobiography is called Apna Bachpan Apne Kandhon Par, my childhood on my shoulders. This has been translated, so I'm relying on both actually, the Hindi and the English translation. Bechen belongs to a leather inca in Uttar Pradesh, and it's a fairly big autobiography and very large autobiography, and it has very very detailed accounts of leatherworking lives, the humiliation that it brings, the violence that it brings, and so on and so forth. But there's also, amidst all of that, very interesting experiences, very interesting accounts where Bechen and his family members are reclaiming leatherwork as something that they feel a lot of pride in. And not just leatherwork, but also the sensations of leatherwork, the kind of sensory marks that work leaves on their lives are claimed with a great sense of pride, almost like the pride that Chauhan was talking about with his uncle being able to catch pigs very well, right? And so for instance, Bechen says that leatherwork is something that doesn't require bookish knowledge and is not even looked upon by the society as something respectable. But he says, put any Brahmin to the test and they will fail, because they will not be able to lift these carcasses, or they'll not be able to do leather work, which is, of course, ethnographically also true. So there's this interesting way in which, in writing, Bechen is also reconfiguring knowledge as sensory, right? And saying knowledge is not just of the mind, but it's also bodily, it's sensory, it's got to do with touch, it's got to do with who will touch what, and thus who has expertise in what. Now, Bechen's paternal aunt, his bua, so to say, is a very powerful figure in the autobiography, and she would tell, her side of the family history. And she would say that she's very proud to be from a family of tanners, because they were the first ones in their area who were able to build a concrete house and sustain a large family entirely on this trade. And she says, everyone in my family has silver jewelry, right? And we know the kind of politics around women's bodies and jewelry vis-a-vis caste. And so her assertion that, the visual markers of defying caste, right? That everyone in my family has silver jewelry because of leatherwork, right? Leatherwork has given us that. She also recalls a specific episode where her brother, Bechen's father, was carrying tanned hides on his, wanted to carry tanned hides across the Ganga in the city of Bulandshahr at Rajghat. Right, and she recalls that there was a sipahi or a guard on duty there who said, you cannot carry chamra, you cannot carry leather across the Ganga, since it is unclean, it's apavitra and against the Hindu dharma. And his father replies that, the leather will not touch Ganga at any point. The leather will be on my head and I will cross Ganga. Now, of course, the reader knows that the problem is the leather, but the problem is also Bechen's father's body, which is supposedly polluted, but the Sipahi is not saying that, right? And so the guard doesn't relent, and his father says, but if I can cross the Ganga, and I am made of skin, I am made of leather, how can this raw hide then be polluted, right? All of us are made of skin, made of leather. The guard is unrelenting, and apparently Bechen's father then recites a couplet which is attributed in the autobiography to the Bhakti poet Kabir. And it's a very short thing. I'm going to read it out in the original Braj and then the translation in English. He says, Cham ke hum hain, cham ke tum ho. Cham is chamra, cham is skin. So cham ke hum hain, cham ke tum ho. Cham ka sakal pasara hai. Sakal pasara is the entire world. कहत कबीर सुनो भाई साधो कौन चाम से न्यारा है, right? So I am made of skin and so are you. Everyone is made of skin. So Kabir is saying, please pay attention. Does skin ever leave anyone, right? So very, very powerful sort of assertion on the universality of beings, on the universality of bodies. The guard, however, ultimately asks Bechan's father to give the, very interesting, to give the skins to his Muslim associate, Bashir, as norms of Hindu religion do not apply to him. And Bashir is able to take the hides across the Ganga. This is very curious, and we need to think a little more about that. Right. Singh also talks about another relative, an old man who's been a tanner all his life. And when Chauhan talks to him about why didn't you leave this occupation when you had the chance to, why didn't you leave when others were quitting, this old gentleman actually says that, look at my hands, they are permanently tanned red, right? They're permanently tanned with the brown red color of leather. So if I change my occupations, will this change? Will my skin really change, right? And then he says something very, very interesting that, the government is sending tanned hides abroad now, but nobody calls Bata a chamar or untouchable for making shoes, right? Bata, of course, the big shoe company. And he says, on the other hand, I have been able to buy 10 bighas of land, educate my two sons who are officers in Allahabad, and educate my daughter, and marry her into a non-tanning family. And so, what is the point of leaving this occupation really when it has given me so much, but also when the occupation will never leave me? It's permanently sort of marked my body. And this older gentleman, and I'm going to end with this older gentleman also then comes up with a very interesting couplet, which is, again, I'll do the Hindi English thing. And he says, टाटा कहाँ लोहार है, टाटा ऑफ कोर्स द टाटास, तो टाटा कहाँ लोहार है, बाटा कहाँ चमार, चाम काम के नाम पर घृणा हमें रही मार. So Tata is not called an ironsmith by anyone. Bata is not called a leather worker, but it is only us who are getting caught in this hateful leather work, right? It's only us that are sort of bearing the brunt for working with leather. So cham kam is leather. Right. Um, so where are we at really? We are at a situation right now where we're seeing incredibly complex narratives of pride reclamation, some sort of turning the nose back, but also which is laced and intermixed with violence and humiliation, because we can't seem to wish that away, right? It's a very material part of how caste operates. And so there are these attempts by writers to to sort of deploy the sensory against the Brahminical versions of their lives. But of course, the violent sensations do sort of creep back in every once in a while. But there's also something that these narratives are doing for us as readers. And I'm just taking on Guru's suggestion of, they invoke guilt in us. Of course, they invoke guilt in especially the upper caste readers, but also readers from any community who are reading these experiences. It's a very strong invocation of guilt. But since reading has primarily been thought of as an audio-visual process, what does it mean when we sort of shift it to a more synesthetic activity, an activity which is more affective, more sensorial, where the worlds of the reader and writer sort of become conjoined because of sensory experience and memory and sort of sensory perception, right? Now, within sort of the caste discourse, sorry, not within the caste discourse, within a lot of South Asian philosophical traditions, which do not quite think of the senses as the five distinct senses as the Western traditions do, our sensory perception is thought of as necessarily synesthetic, in the sense that when we do darshan, for instance, in the Hindu logic, um, uh, when we look at the god, when we do darshan of the god, we're also consuming the god. When we sniff the food offered to the god, we're also tasting the food. So you don't sniff the food offered to the gods. So there is already, so the system in which caste is operating, the sensory system in which caste is operating, is a very, very synesthetic kind of an object. And we have Aniket Javre's very powerful invocation that by consuming Dalit autobiographies, upper caste readers are willing to eat the Dalit. So they are willing to consume the life of the Dalit and Dalit narratives, but they will never eat with the Dalit, right? And thinking through that, then what does it really mean when we smell leather in these narratives, when we taste certain kinds of food in these narratives? What does it mean when we read about pig catching or leather work in these narratives? We need to rethink our relationship as readers. We probably need to, if done more sensorily, we need to rethink our relationship to the text as not just a passive consumer, but also someone who is then written into the text, either via guilt or via the sensory. Okay, I'm going to stop here. And yeah, please, I really want to listen to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kapoor. An excellent presentation. And I wish you could go on, but I think you made your crisp points. I would now request our discussant today, Deepak, to come in and share with us what he thought about, of course, the paper that he's engaged with, but also your presentation. And meanwhile, others could probably, type in their questions in the chat box or stay ready with them after. Thank you.
Hi, am I audible? All right. Hmm. So, thank you for your interesting presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you. Like, it was a great experience listening to you. So, I mainly have 3 points to make, like 3 remarks, or rather, I want to bring them into discussion. I like the focus that focus on smell because in the philosophical tradition, when we speak about Kant, he's mainly, or anybody else for that matter, the biggest focus is always on the sight and the visibility of it. But smell is something is that cannot be done away with. Like it has some very strong associations with memory also. So we can perhaps invisibilize people, like their bodies and their language. But smell is something that seems very difficult to just invisibilize. Yeah, so that is one of the points that I wanted to make. That even in the, like if there's a tannery, it has to be located in a certain part of the city wherein it wouldn't make a problem for the cities. For example, it cannot be in a residential space. So that is a thing that I wanted to point out. And then uh, I also wanted to point out that um you spoke about violence and humiliation and degradation of labor, but uh, in your essay there was also a sense that it's not, so the work is not necessarily and entirely associated with a certain caste identity. But even when people of the other castes are engaging in that occupation, they also somehow do not feel uh, a sense of pride while undertaking the labor. Yeah, and then the third point the third theme that I wanted to bring into discussion, that there's an undertone of also desire, which is associated with smell. Like you spoke of the short story by Philoria Batpu, I at the same time when I was reading your essay, I thought of Saadat Hasan Manto's short story Boo, which is also the sexual desire towards a woman who is not from his caste, and then what kind of sensory remnants he has when the woman is away. But at the same time, if we think of leather as a commodity, it also becomes an object of desire. One, because of its status, symbolism, and also there's an entire industry which has been created just to satiate that desire of that. So it was very like latent in my reading of your essay, but I think that is also uh, quite observable in the points that you're making. So yeah, I'll rest now.
Thank you, Deepak. Dr. Kapoor, would you want to kind of respond to some of the things that Deepak is saying at this moment? Do you want to collect some more questions?
Yeah, let me briefly respond to Deepak, and maybe that will also bring different kinds of questions. So, Deepak, thank you so much for that careful reading, and I agree with everything that you've said, but thank you particularly for bringing into discussion a couple of things. One is the question of philosophy. And yes, for those of us who are interested in Western sort of philosophy or Western political thought, I think it's very significant to sort of acknowledge that. Um, the Platonic line in philosophy. So Plato, and then of course we go into Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. But then, right, like Deepak rightly said, Plato to Kant actually. Um, Philosophy has been thought of as not just a cited thing, but also a thing of the rational mind, right? And so Plato, of course, is the whole cave metaphor, and his entire idea of forms and his entire idea of philosopher king and the real world is a play on vision, is a play on sight, right? And by the time we come to Kant, we have kind of equated knowledge with the rational thinking mind, and that rational thinking mind is a seeing mind, so not just metaphorically but also physically, so much so that both Descartes and Kant would actually then say that um, the other senses, the evidence of the world that we get from other senses is not so reliable. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, but I would also say that there's a recovery there, there is a possibility there. And sense study scholars are saying, what if we don't follow Plato, Descartes, Kant, but what if we were to follow Aristotle, Rousseau, Spinoza? Right? What if we were to follow that line? We get a very different sense of what political philosophy or philosophy could give us vis-a-vis how we look at the world and how we evidence the world and so on and so forth, right? And so today, affect theory borrows entirely from Spinoza and goes on from Spinoza onwards to Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. And so that trajectory is also quite possible. And the second thing, thanks, which you brought into the discussion, and thanks for that, Deepak, is this question of other castes. And you're very right that the leather industry today, precisely because it's a global industry, it's a very export-oriented industry, it involves every caste group. So if when I started sort of researching on and doing fieldwork on the leather industry, and I would say I want to look at caste in the leather industry, people inside the industry would say, but there is no caste here, right? Everybody from any location, caste location, works here. And they were right, they do work there, but it's the kind of work that they do, right? So who's actually doing the cleaning of hides and the processing of hides and the sort of scraping of hides, versus who's doing the leather designing, right? And who's doing the leather merchandising. And you're absolutely right that because of the very strong association between leatherwork and caste. And there's been a very long history of both the colonial and the post-colonial state trying to get other castes into leatherwork, but that pride hasn't come. Right. In fact, there's a sense of embarrassment, there's a sense of shame, there's a lot of reticence at working in the leather industry. Also, because questions of religion get in, questions of food preferences get in. So, if I'm a vegetarian but I'm actually working with hides, I see, I mean, these are interviews that I have taken in the industry. People see a great contradiction between that sort of personal self of theirs and the professional life that they lead. And so, in other places, I have actually argued that what was needed by, especially the post colonial state, was to de-link leather work, manual scavenging, sanitation work, midwifery, a lot of these occupations. The the thing that should have happened is delinking them from caste. But since that did not happen, and it was very easy for the state to continue with these associations because it gave a steady supply of labor, it gave it let the state not train people, and so on and so forth. That connection has stayed, and so today we are at a situation where people join BTech. So the lowest rankings in any engineering entrance goes to BTech in leather engineering. And people who join BTech in leather engineering opt out of it after a few years. They try and shift to other branches. Um, those who do finish it often say that, okay, we just did it, but then we'll do an MBA and we'll go and do a banking job. Because this is not something, this BTech is not very respected, right? And BTech is just one example, but almost every degree in leatherwork is undergoing such a crisis. So that, and yes, the desire for leather and smell as desirable is something that's just waiting to be written. So please sort of take that invitation, anyone who's listening, and please work something on it. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, also for possible, future research projects, ideas on future research projects. Both you and Deepak have kind of pushed us in that direction. Questions. We have something. I'm going to read out the question because if we have a differently abled friend here, they shouldn't lose out. So I have a very basic question. This is Shubha Deep. While working on caste and smell, I find it a bit challenging to imagine smell when there's no such reference of smell. For example, a site of a wasteland where a Dalit is wandering, how can we analyze it by using sensory analysis?
Okay. Should we take a few questions and
Yeah.
then if there are more?
The more questions, you may please unmute yourself and ask that question.
Hi,
Uh,
Ram here.
Hello, Ram. Ram, yeah,
Oh,
you'll
yeah,
have.
can I speak?
Yeah, please,
Yeah.
please do, please do.
So, hi, Shivani, and hi, Deepak, and Dark Team. I think so. The presentation was really good, and the commentary was also very good. I want to kind of emphasize two short questions. One is regarding the point which you made when you initially kind of made this provocation that while engaging with Dalit autobiographies, so they also help us understand the limits of ethnography. So it was a very interesting point to think about that indeed the ways in which ethnography is thought about and the way in which self-expression in terms of autobiography is imagined, it is a very interesting point to think about. So second point is about I was thinking about the short film or the short story of Premchand Sadgati. And the film by Satyajit Ray. So I was thinking that how within that movie we see that the trial and tribulation of Dukhi, the main character who kind of who seems is seen as simply instrument in terms of the kind of free labor the person is supposed to do, and after death he's disposed like any other kind of he's a non-entity in fact, but still seen as a part of problem how to kind of tackle that body after his death and all. So I was thinking, how do we kind of look at these kind of representation or these kind of practices whereby the necessity and the kind of contradiction both they exist simultaneously. So yeah, so broadly this is it. Thank
Thank you, Ram. Are there any other questions? Or maybe Mridula Nevare has also raised her hand. Shivani, is that okay if we take another question? Oh, yeah. Mridula, you may please unmute yourself and
Uh, yes, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, you specialize in olfactory studies, right? So I just wanted to ask, like, which are the sort of journals one should read if, one wants to read more about the olfactory study, or something about the olfactory studies, or wants to publish something.
I think you can start with some of the great work that Dr. Kapoor has already done, and then she'll answer the rest
I
of the question.
actually, I wanted to tell you something. I actually read your uh, in that book. You had a collections like odors as resistance, and you started with Jutan by Om Prakash Valmiki's The Smell of Cause, Body, Self, and Politics. And I was writing a research paper, for my assignment in college, and that's how I got to know
Okay,
that
wonderful.
studies are also a primary. Yeah.
Wonderful. We let Dr. Kapoor answer your and other questions now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for those questions. Let me start with the last one, Mridula. Mridula, thanks for reading something that I have written. That always is very exciting because our readership is this tiny. So, thank you so much for reading and engaging with it. And the one big journal, not just olfaction, because that's very niche, but the one big journal in sensory studies globally is something called the Senses and the Society. It's published by a group of people who are in the University of Concordia in Canada. And so their website is also a very interesting resource for tracking publication calls, conferences, new publications. So Concordia is something that you should be on your radar. Other than that, a lot of journals, especially in sociology, a lot of journals publish things on many kinds of senses. So, sound studies, of course, and sound studies is the only one which will have dedicated journals. So, I mean, I can give you a list. But there are, so for instance, Journal of South Asia, which is again a big prominent social studies, social sciences journal, does publish a lot of work on the senses. Contributions to Indian sociology also does, Asian studies also does. So if you just do a Google Scholar search, you will find a lot of these journals popping up. But the one journal, if you want to follow, then it should be Senses and the Society. That's the one. Okay. Ram's question. Yeah, thank you, Ram. Yeah, the first one. So when I said autobiography or writing as the limits, as something that um, sort of fills in the gaps that ethnography leaves, or it's something that begins after the limits of ethnography, I was also talking about my peculiar case, but more and more I am seeing that historians, for instance, who traditionally would only work with the archive, are now turning to literature because, and also, I mean, with this I'm also sort of going towards Shubhadeep's question that especially if we are looking for material, sensory or even other kinds of material, which is not available in traditional archives, or which is not accessible through methods like fieldwork or interviews or ethnography. literature is stepping in. Now, of course, there's that difficulty of putting together two different methodologies and two different kinds of truth claims, because literature has a certain kind of claim to knowledge, and ethnography or archives or fieldwork has a different kind of claim. So then it becomes our job as a researcher to put those two claims together. But say, for instance, in the case of my ethnography, I was working in a very, for instance, a very male field. So it was not always possible for me to talk to everyone and under all circumstances and talk about everything. And so I relied on a lot of literature to fill in those gaps where I'm not really able to get to my respondents or have a very sort of detailed, intimate conversation with them. But that's where literature steps in. So that's one way um, in which I blend together literature and ethnography. Um, so, Shubhadeep, your question about how do you read the senses when the senses are just not available, right? So, one is this, that you do a mixed methods thing. And so, if you are, I think the example you took is a garbage dump, if I'm not wrong. So, if you're doing an ethnography of the garbage dump and the smell is everywhere, but there's no way to record that smell, or there is no way to transact that smell, or nobody's talking about it really. um, there'll be other ways. So for instance, of course the obvious one is writings on garbage, films, writings, gestures, non-verbal communication, all of that. But another interesting way would be to flip your side. So instead of actually talking about people who are at the garbage dump, talk to localities surrounding it, right? And see if they don't mention the smell. They will mention the smell, right? So change your respondent, change your context. But also, I mean, those of us who do sensory studies, everything except sound and visual, because those senses are easily recorded and um, easily sort of talked about also. Everybody else has found sort of ways to read between or sniff between the lines literally. And so a lot of our material is also written in codes, right? And if you want to read up more on this, I would suggest, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but MSS Pandian has a lovely, fantastic critical piece in the EPW called One Step Outside Modernity, where he talks about encoding. And he gives you an example, which is again coming from literature. And uh, Professor Pandian was a great advocate of bringing in literature into the social sciences, right? And so he looks at the autobiography of R.K. Narayanan, and he says, in a period where there were intense caste struggles happening all over India, Narayan's autobiography seems to have no mention of caste, at least initially. But when you close read it, you realize that everything in his life was arranged according to caste. And so when he says he moved to Mysore and wanted to find a new house, he said it was very difficult to find a house because they wanted a house for two or three brothers. Everybody should have a separate room and their privacy. And then they had a Great Dane, and the dog would eat meat, but the rest of the family wouldn't. So they wanted an outhouse where the dog's meat could be cooked, and they wanted a helper who could cook the meat and feed the dog. And very beautifully, Pandian says that this is not caste, what is, right? And so here is Pandian reading caste into a narrative which doesn't mention the word at all, right? And I've taken great inspiration from that kind of a method to say, okay, how is it that hygiene or sanitation or concerns of disease are sort of coded ways to talk about caste, right? Or how are questions of not feeling well or nausea or sort of feeling ill at ease also coded ways to talk about smell, for instance, right? And so We manage. We learn from each other and we manage when obvious material is not available. Ram's question of Sadgati. Ram, I'm not quite sure I understand your point about necessity and contradiction per se. But how to look at these representations and practices? I mean, see, Premchand is very contested, right? And Premchand did write about caste, unlike many other authors of his generation. Um, and Premchand is much sort of much critiqued for writing about caste in a certain way, right? And Sadgati is one of those narratives which gets critiqued a lot by saying that, for instance, many critics have argued that why do the Dalit characters have to necessarily be drunk? Why do they have to necessarily be bad husbands in a Premchand like narrative, right? And those are very, very valid critiques. So, but we must also understand that any author and their writing is a product of the times, right? And so Premchand is writing for a certain audience and is responding to the social cues and the social milieu of his time, which is not inexcusable because there are other writers in that period who are writing very critically about caste, right? But Premchand chooses not to. So Premchand chooses to write about caste in a certain way. And in that limited bracket, I think Sadgati and other novels like this do do a decent job. They do a powerful job because they do show this, um, like you very rightly said, they do show this very dark underside to the caste society, where he does show the malice of the upper castes quite well, right? And because of who Premchand is, because he's someone whose writings are written in a particular kind of Hindi and they have a very wide audience and they are taught in school textbooks. And somebody who doesn't read Hindi but is beginning to read Hindi, one of the first things you will read is Premchand. So it's that kind of spread. So if that allows a narrative like Sadgati to reach an unsuspecting audience and trigger something, I would take it, right? Over, say, somebody like Arkinara. Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
Are there any other questions? I think Ram and I we've been struggling with this bit of the fashioning of the Dalit self in some of the conversations, and I think from it seems like a, if not entirely satisfactory but partially satisfactory approach in terms of taking what is available for a wider canvas.
No, but I think it's really important to critique also. I mean, see, Premchand was writing for a nationalist project. And the early Premchand, which is the Premchand who writes in Urdu, is completely subsumed under um, this second version of Premchand, right? So that has something to say about how and what he is writing. And there's now interesting work coming out on thinking about the place of caste in the in the late nationalist struggle, so the early 20th century. What was the ways in which caste was really, or what the upper castes were saying and writing about caste, how it was very deeply linked to what was happening in the nationalist politics at that time, right? So Charu Gupta's work, for instance, will tell this story through gender, the question of gender and humor and community and sexuality and so on and so forth. So I think we also need to understand that understand the context in which a writer like Premchand is writing, the limitations of what he's writing, and of course critique, because when he's writing, so much is happening on caste. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Questions, concerns, comments? So we're going to wait another like 6 seconds, and then we'll bring the session to a close, because usually we finish in an hour, but the number of questions and the interventions have led us to short up the time by good 15 minutes. So yes, there's somebody wants to say something. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Someone had put their question in the comments. Have we discussed that?
I think Shubhadeep had uh, an extension, and after that, I don't think there was another question. We've answered yes.
Okay, sorry.
No, we need moral keepers of conscience also. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Sakshi, is that okay? Sakshi Vadva has a question. Thank you for your insightful session. I would like to ask if you could elaborate on the idea of delinking occupation and caste. Given that identity based discrimination persists even when people from marginalized castes occupy socially prestigious positions, do you think the delinking occupation and caste is a sufficient measure to achieve inclusivity?
Okay. Thank you for that question, Sakshi. Let me flip it around and ask you, um, have we not been able to achieve delinking of caste between upper castes and their occupations? Yeah, so we no longer find it acceptable to say that only Brahmins should study or only Kshatriyas should enter the army, right? So at some level, and also what happens is that when we say delink caste and occupation, we are invariably thinking of lower caste and their occupations. So we don't quite think that there are also occupational linkages between upper castes and what they do, right? And so even though some amount of delinking has happened, but it's still a fact that, say, in education, for instance, in higher education, um, we have a very, very, very severe underrepresentation of anybody from the Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi groups, for instance, right? So there are ways in which occupation and caste are linked at every level, right? And there's Rennie Thomas's work, which looks at scientists in Indian Institute of Science, for instance, who are mostly Brahmins, who are saying that science is like their natural calling, along with classical music, because they are almost naturally ordained to good science and good music, and anybody else who manages to become a scientist is in it for the money, they would tell Rennie, right? And not really for the love of science or for the love of music. And so there is, and you're very right, Sakshi, in saying that on the other end of the spectrum, when that delinking has happened, so a leather worker's child not doing leather work, that has not led to a complete sense of sort of dissociation or egalitarian ethic or anything at all. And we see that constantly. And so when I say dealing occupation and caste, I would say it first needs to be done institutionally, right? And so, for instance, um, something like manual scavenging um, is only done by certain communities across India, right? And so, what does the state do? The state will say, okay, but we take out contracts and tenders which anybody can fill, right? And anybody does fill them, but they become contractors and then they hire people from certain Dalit castes to then again perform the job, right? So then what do we need? We need better implementation. We need better sort of adherence to protocols and laws saying that you cannot subcontract this work, right? And one is that. The second would be to look at education. Our systems of higher education are in a dismal state, where by default, people who reach higher education and are able to stay in higher education and are able to stay in non-vocational higher education are invariably upper caste. And nobody is doing it with nobody sitting and sort of doing it there on purpose, but the systems are so designed there's lack of scholarships, there is lack of resources, there is lack of sort of mental health support, emotional support, so on and so forth. And so it's very difficult for someone who is already struggling with marginalization and stigmatization to actually then reach institutes of higher education and stay in them. So when we are not sort of decentralizing education, we won't be able to decentralize occupation as well, right? And so it's a very, very complex issue. And I won't say the state has like completely failed at it. No, it has implemented affirmative action. It has implemented reservations. And we are seeing the effects of almost 5 decades of reservations now, when there is including OBC reservations, where there's a completely different character of educational institutions that we are seeing, which is much more diverse, much more challenging, much more sort of resisting. And so the state has done it, of course. But it needs to do more and do things differently when these very complex issues of certain kinds of occupations and their caste linkages are concerned.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, uh, the 6 seconds are over. And on that note, I would now extend a heartfelt gratitude to the speaker today, Dr. Shivani Kapoor, for taking out the time and sharing her very valuable work. Of course, some of us have been following some of the stuff that you've been doing, especially for our PhD works also. But for you to take out this time, and I know that it took us a while to get there, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And we would hopefully, in future also, once some of the new directions that your work takes, we'll invite you again to speak to us. I would also extend a great many thanks to our participants today, to the discussant, Deepak, who's part of the team, for engaging with this work and sharing his thoughts, and the participants who joined us on a Saturday evening and asked questions. We will come again next Saturday. This is a weekly, our Baithak is a weekly event, and we'll be here again at 4 p.m. next Saturday. And we hope to see you all again. Thank you so much. And with this, I'll bring the session to a close. Thank you. Thank you.